Luke McCormack.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Schmalz Show. I'm Luke McCormack, and during today's show we will be discussing progress being made with identity and access management programs in the federal government. With me on today's show are Amir, Dastouri, Identity Services Branch Manager, Homeland Security; Jay Brooks, Senior Executive for Identity and Access Management with the FBI; Colonel Tom Clancy, Director of Identity Management Programs, Department of Defense; Shane Cashdollar, Director of Federal Cybersecurity, KPMG; and Steve Schmalz, Field Chief Technology Officer, RSA Public Sector. Well, this certainly is a big subject. It's a complex and complicated subject. So now that we have hybrid environments and cloud environments and multiple enclaves and no enclaves, and we've got 800 series and draft guidance out there and guidance from OMB being pulled back and sort of consolidated. And I think about some of this technology out there now, blockchain, but I also think about things like IoT, right? And robotic process automation and some of these bots where you have to identify them, right? It's getting into a whole nother enclave of identity here. So a lot to talk about today. Let's start with you, Amir. Tell us what's the state of the state with identity management over at Department of Homeland Security?
Sure, Luke, thanks. I appreciate it. Department of Homeland Security, we've made good progress over the past year. Picking off from where we were last year, our Access Lifecycle Management or Identity Governance effort has expanded over to the entirety of the Management Directorate and expanding to headquarters for our onboarding and offboarding process. This has really improved our ability to offboard, especially contractor access, by reviewing who's here, who's not here, removing access when they're offboarded or when their contracts expire, making sure their PIV cards are revoked, their personnel securities are inactivated, and their network accounts are disabled, so cutting off access to all of our systems. From there, we'll also go in enterprise, expanding to FEMA as a second component using ALM. Our derived credentials effort and our mobile device management has also greatly improved over the past year. Last time we talked about it, we were rolling it out. We were starting, and FEMA was using it during the hurricanes. Now we're at 7 out of 10 components and about 72,000 derived credentials being used for strong authentication to email and to several web applications across the department. And our continuous diagnostics and mitigation effort, partnering with our MPPD partners, has rolled out to the enterprise and given us the ability to report on unprivileged access throughout the entire department. And things like, are they suitable, are they trained, and are they using strong authentication to access our network? And as we expand upon that, our attribute exchange service is also picking up new work, especially integrating with our training systems to be able to automate things like, have you taken your security training, cut off access? Have you taken your privilege training, remove your privileged account? And sharing common identity data with all of our components.
Wow,
so
there's a lot of activity going on at the Department of Homeland Security. It sounds like you guys are on a roll over there. Colonel, how about at DoD? How are things going over there these days with the identity?
Hi, good afternoon, Luke, and thanks so much for having me on the show. This year's been pretty exciting in the Department of Defense. The Secretary issued a national defense strategy that has 3 lines of effort, which identity is an integral part. Sure. We've got to improve lethality. We're trying to strengthen alliances and interoperability with partners, and we're trying to execute the reforms the department needs. And obviously, identity is central to enabling all of those activities. Additionally, the CIO has established priorities including the cloud, artificial intelligence, the network, as well as cybersecurity. So in response to that, we've been putting together an identity, credential, and access management strategy to enable all of those, including a roadmap by which we'll implement those across the department. So the implementation roadmap includes capabilities and shared services, as well as significant policy revisions, robusting our governance in this area, as well as really focusing on identity data as the fundamental underpinning for a lot of these capabilities across the very broad mission and activity space of the department. We're in the process now of doing the investment part of enabling that roadmap, and the military departments and the CIO have also embraced this as really a cornerstone of that cyber risk buy down in the investment process.
You know, your CIO was up at ELC in Philadelphia, just got back yesterday, and your CIO was up there, gave a keynote, and he couldn't have been more crisp about the priorities of the for the Department of Defense over the next couple of years. So it's fantastic to hear that. Shane, how about at KPMG? What's sort of the state out there? What are you seeing in the community in regards to this fantastic technology?
Sure. Thanks, Luke, for having me here today. Really appreciate it. Excited to participate in this conversation. So, from the KPMG perspective, I think that it's important to note not all agencies are quite as advanced as Amir and his team over at DHS and that mature just yet. And I think that's okay.
DOD, right?
Yeah, we're in DOD. I mean, these guys are exemplars of the right way to do it.
We want the audience to recognize that.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, but some of the agencies that we've been working with, one in particular that I've been working with, kind of in the federal financing homeowners area. Has just been really great for me, and it's been exciting to work with because while they're not that advanced, they're committed to doing it the right way, right? So that's something that I love to see from a client perspective when they go in and they have the buy-in from the leadership right down CIO, CTO level, and they're committed to doing things the right way. So they don't just go and buy that new hot IAM tool that the vendors are flashing in front of them. They spend the time to build the strategy and roadmap to really understand where they are today so that they can understand where they want to go to kind of meet the goals of their agency. So it's been a real pleasure of mine working with them, and the IAM program office that we've set up there is something that I'm really proud of, and I think that they're really excited about, which makes it exciting for me.
Look, let's face it, OMB has certainly motivated everyone to move along as far as identity management, and clearly we know how credential hijacking has been a major vulnerability, but we also know that when you're blazing the trail, you're in the cutting edge, and there's some turbulence in doing that, right? And there's a lot of lessons learned that other agencies can use as the technology matures and the processes mature. Jay, how about over at FBI? What's the state of the program over there in regards to identity access and management?
Well, thank you. It's a great question, Luke, and good morning to you, and thank you for having me back on the panel. Sure. We are making steady progress in advancing our IAM programs across the board. We broke it down into two areas. One is the governance aspect. The last time I was on the program, we were just starting to ramp up an IAM council that would represent the various organizations and technologies across the Bureau. Had a lot of success in bringing together different senior executives and technical architects in driving out some real standardization. Most notably, we've started to standardize the attributes as far as identifying employees and making sure that they're passed among the various disparate systems within the Bureau. From a technology standpoint, we've implemented certain employee self-service applications like password resets, things that normally would require a third party to intervene between a system and another employee. By doing this, we're again eliminating the possibility that there would be some seepage or penetration from password resets, as well as delivering 15,000 PIV cards. Last year, when I was on the program, we had about 2,000 within the FBI. Now we're at 17,000. So it was a big push using the PIV technology to basically ensure that we have good collaboration and facility access across the federal government. And then lastly, we've upgraded our internal PKI system to the NSS standard and delivered 19,000 cards across the organization. A big challenge as far as changing our applications to, one, accept the new NSS standards, as well as the distribution of those 19,000 cards that I'll talk a little bit later about.
Sure, and I know that was a big commitment on the FBI's part to take that on, and from just a financial standpoint, from a technological standpoint, et cetera. So I applaud you guys for taking that on. Steve, how about at RSA? I know you guys are right smack in the middle of a lot of these activities that are going on, everything from the CDM stuff, et cetera. Tell us, what's the state of the programs as far as where you guys sit?
So thank you, Luke, for having me back. And
Sure.
As I look across the DoD and the rest of the federal government, there are a couple of things that really come up front. And one of those is the recognition throughout various organizations that, one form of strong two-factor authentication doesn't fit every scenario. The CAC and PIV dominate
We learned that
authentication.
painfully, over a period of time, right?
Absolutely.
The good old PD-12.
And they are fantastic methodologies, but sometimes you need alternative forms of strong authentication. And whether it's within the DoD or in FBI, there are multiple places where alternate forms of two-factor authentication are used and used effectively. And the fact that these organizations are recognizing that, establishing policy, working through use cases, working with the vendors, and working with the various components within their organizations to make sure that everybody understands this and understands the appropriate place for these technologies to be deployed. I think that's a big change. Just as a quick story, in the past, what would happen, let's say within the DoD, is that you would identify an area where the CAC card might not be appropriate. And the organization that had to deploy alternative forms of authentication would have to go and get a waiver. And the waiver would basically say, and Colonel Clancy can correct me if I'm wrong on this, the waiver would basically say, if this isn't appropriate, if you're not able to achieve use of the CAC card within the next 6 months to a year, you can continue to use this alternative form. But what would happen in practice is that year after year after year, this component would go back and it'd get the waiver. So, to make a long story short, what's happened is these organizations have decided that there's no reason to have this continuous, reevaluation, that they would look long term and point things out and make sure the organizations understood policy sort of well enough to deploy alternative forms of two-factor and to keep them deployed in the field without having to do the intense
paperwork. That's a very good catch. I'm glad you brought that up. Look, we're all part of sort of that wooden mallet technique of just sort of whacking the table and saying you must do a CAT card, PIV card, two-factor authentication. And of course, a lot of the new technology came available as well that allowed for a lot of other means for two-factor authentication. And I have to applaud OMB now, and I think they'll reflect that in the new circular that it's really now meeting the spirit and intent, right? They're also doing this with the TIC and some of these other things and moving away from sort of hard and fast and, okay, what is the intent of what we're trying to do? Absolutely. And allow these new technologies to come into the fold, if you will, and solve some of these issues. Well, let's talk about a specific program. Colonel, let's start with you. Tell us about a specific program that you're working on over there at the DoD in regards to implementing these capabilities.
Well, Luke, and I think to Steve's point about the way forward, we're continuing to rely upon PKI, the public key infrastructure, as the backbone for how we function in the organization to identify
when
things.
When it works, use it, right?
We always come back to that.
Yeah.
And programmatically, that is really what we have to build on in the Department of Defense. Even though we've spent a lot of time expanding those capabilities, supporting additional use cases, programmatically it's just the PKI. So as a part of our roadmap, we're trying to identify where do we have these places where it's not a waiver, it's an approved use case where we're using a different type of a credential with a different assurance level that's appropriate for the sensitivity of that mission and the data being exchanged. But we have to figure out how to put that into the portfolio as something that we're going to sustain. I think that what we're finding when we use these alternative credentials, as long as you're in a single enclave, that makes a lot of sense. But when we talk about using alternate credentials that are registration based or something like FIDO, when you want to use that outside of your security boundary, you have to come back to some sort of federation mechanism, and we're still trying to identify how do we build that so that it is interoperable with all the mission partners that are so key to figuring out how to get the job done. I do think, I want to highlight within the PKI framework, DoD is continuing to modify and modernize the CAC card so that it's more PIV-like. We're going to finish that over the next 18 months. It takes that long to switch out a credential that's so broadly deployed with over 3 million users. Also, that same PKI program is how we're credentialing on mobile platforms. So DISA's purebred capability, which has got tens of thousands of deployed credentials, actively working. They're enhancing that, to include a hardware attestation element that'll give it a higher assurance level so that it is truly a peer to the medium hardware PKI that we enjoy on the
That
CAC.
sounds fantastic. It's CAT Card 2.0, right? Shane, how about at KPMG? Give us an example of a specific program. You touched on one a minute ago that you guys are unpacking and solving some big problems.
Sure, yeah, and I'd really like to add on to what Colonel Clancy and Steve said. So I think that, it's easy for us to look at, authentication methods as how can we make it more secure, right? So we want PIV where we can have PIV. RSA tokens are a great alternative where those don't work, but I try to encourage my clients to look at it from a different angle, right? So there's a new quote-unquote kind of form of consumer identity and access management, right? So CIAM, or customer identity and access management. And this is something that's really, I think, been pioneered from our financial sector side, right? Where there's a
lot of us end up using it, right?
Exactly, right? So there's a really strong need.
You know, that kind of thing.
So the need for security is really clear, right? So you're protecting financial institutions. But the way that they look at it is not even from the security side, but it's from that end user side, right? So they go through the journey mapping and figure out how people use the system and then add security in there to make it work for them, right? So I think that those efforts, if we can apply them even in the DoD, right? So if we treat our end users as if they're customers, as if they had another choice where they're using our system because they want to, not because that they have to. I think that's a really good way to think about it, because it helps us build solutions that are better for them, and solutions that are better for them means that they'll think of less ways to go around it and subvert it and create more security roles.
Jay, how about at the FBI? Give us an example of a specific program that you're drilling into over there.
Well, it would definitely be the PIV technology. We started the implementation last fiscal year, and it's really taken off. I mean, the technology itself, I know, has been established for a while, but we're starting to gather our steam in pushing out the cards and the other technologies that are needed to support it. The reason for it being such a great effort within the Bureau is to ensure that we have better ability to collaborate across our different organizations, whether it's between us and OMB or OPM or any of these other outside organizations. It makes those kinds of logical connections easier. Beyond that, the physical access aspects are also amazing. Being able to go into different buildings without having to pass credentials or other security information makes it extremely easy for intelligence analysts and special agents to, again, collaborate with other organizations, access their offices better, making it, again, more efficient for us to do our jobs and whatnot.
A much broader use of that capability, right, when you're starting to look at the building control systems, et cetera. And, FBI, along with a few other agencies, including Homeland, have that dual role of, sort of sitting in the IC and also sitting in the law enforcement world, and trying to sort of fuse that capability together is always a sort of a dual challenge too, right? We'd love to get to one Uber, identity access from that perspective as well.
It's
so
difficult at times.
Yeah, maybe we can touch on that a little bit later. Okay, well, we're going to take a short break, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about programs. But for right now, you've been listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.
Solutions that powers your agency.
Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. With me on today's show are Amir, Department of Homeland Security; Jay Brooks with the FBI; Colonel Clancy, Department of Defense; Shane Cashdollar, KPMG; and Steve Schmalz from RSA Public Sector. We were talking about programs, specific programs. Amir, give us an example of a specific program over at DHS.
Sure. So one of the specific programs we're working on is actually moving our infrastructure over to the cloud. So in doing so, we're building tenants both in Azure and AWS. And speaking of identity and access management, the way that we're moving into Azure is moving our authentication services there first. This is going to build our tenant in Azure and make that reusable by other programs that want to come in. And by moving our authentication services followed by our other identity services there first, it really builds this foundational, I'll call it a management layer, a security layer with our identity services in the cloud. So as tenants come in, we can start offering these authentication services and identity services to each application and each system and each tenant comes in. But the core foundation of our move is starting with building the infrastructure and building the foundation based off of our enterprise identity services.
So that's awesome. So you're not really talking about sort of running the ICAM in the cloud, so to speak. You're talking about really using the ICAM to access the cloud in this sort of multi-hybrid environment and making sure that you're protecting identities in these different enclaves.
Yep. As our perimeter is expanding, there's going to be identities and systems all over the place, whether it's software as a service, infrastructure as a service, or the ones on-prem. We're kind of expanding our capabilities.
Yeah, you recognize and realize how important identity becomes in this multi-factored environment. They said data is the new oil, and I would say that identity is also the new oil, right? In respect to this uniqueness of the individual. Steve, how about at RSA? Tell us about a specific program.
Well, I'd like to give a shout out to DISA, who've been doing some nice research in this area and have been putting programs together to demonstrate how to not just use the classic, who you are, what you have, and what the password, biometric, and some authenticator, but to take the situation into account. It allows you not only to bring more factors into this identity assurance equation, but it allows you to let people authenticate in a way that's appropriate to the situation and puts less demand on them. As an example of if they're coming to work at headquarters and they're sitting down at a desktop, that's a situation that's common. It's more than likely to be them. They've come through the building, they've shown their ID. The type of authentication that you need the identity assurance you need to put in place there is different than I'm sitting at a Starbucks logging in on a mobile device with a Wi-Fi that may or may not be trusted. So DISA is looking at multiple forms, multiple parameters in determining the identity of individuals in different situations, and I think that's a great program.
About like what Shane, you were talking about, what the banking community is doing, right? Sometimes when I'm logging on to different environments, all of a sudden it challenges me and wants some additional information about, what my circumstances are. Even though I'm sure it's sort of read my digital footprint on my device and kind of gone through that algorithm, it recognizes that I'm coming in from a unique environment or a different environment, so it's bringing some more into that calculation, which is interesting.
As well as factoring behavior in.
Right.
What websites you visit, at what time of day you visit those websites, what locations you typically access resources from. All of that's important, and all of that can be put into this equation, which ultimately gives you strong identity assurance.
All this digital dust that we have laying around on our devices, right? All right, well, let's get into lessons learned. I always like to share with the audience some of the lessons learned. I look at these agencies as sort of the trailblazers, if you will, and certainly these partner vendors that are with us here that have a wide footprint on what's going on across the environment. Jay, let's start with you. Just give us some lessons learned as you go on this journey to implement this capability. What are you discovering out there?
So I had some time to think about this over the year, and I would sum it up as one size doesn't fit all. So as we were moving forward with our NSS PKI implementation, we did start to...
What's NSS, so people understand what that is?
National Security Standard, a program that basically ensures that there's a standard way of handling identity and access management. But what we encountered was the fact that the FBI, that does straddle the IC and the law enforcement, has a more distributed environment, whereas the PKI environment that is promoted by NSS is more centralized. So it means that issuing cards takes a great deal more time to get it into the hands of the field operators. Meaning there was like an extreme slowdown of trying to ensure that customers were getting the accesses they need as their old certificate types of security systems started to expire. The other challenge that we faced was the actual integration of the new technologies into our applications. When we were doing the initial testing and deployment work, everything works fine, it looks good, until again you get into the everyday usage. And then you start to see that yes, even though you have a green light and the applications and systems are working, they act a little bit differently. They might slow down the process. They might add additional hurdles for employees to actually overcome, being challenged with different pins, those kinds of things that, again, just change the work dynamic of an individual and their ability to deliver a product.
Yeah, and I recall some of the challenges you guys also have with dealing with the state and locals and those local police departments and the LEO program, right? That's a whole nother level of identity that you guys are dealing with and trying to access some of those systems. Steve, how about at RSA? Give us an example of some lessons learned there that you're discovering that you'd like to share with the audience.
So I guess probably one of the important lessons that we've learned is this concept of governance, not from setting out a set of rules that your employees or that individuals need to follow, but in getting a buy-in from those individuals to take responsibility for their roles in an organization. So we were talking about access management. And although it's important to make sure that you check to see if an individual should or should not have access before they're allowed to start using a resource, it's also important to make sure that you communicated with the right people before you gave them access. So often what happens is that people get access to resources through a process that doesn't check with the owner of that resource. It doesn't check to see whether or not that individual is in the right situation to get access to that resource. It doesn't look at all of the parameters. And with this concept of governance, making sure that everyone is involved in a decision and everybody buys into their role, not just the individuals who are requesting access, but the individuals who own the application, that they have a responsibility to make sure that they control who has access to the application. That within the IT department, that they understand that just being a rubber stamp to request isn't the right way to go. That they need to bring the right individuals involved.
Right? We want to make sure that it's definitely Steve that's logging on to these environments. We want to make sure that Steve's been properly credentialed as he received those credentials. But we also want Steve to recognize, as you're saying, that Steve actually does indeed have the authority to access these systems, and that was vetted properly. So that's a
right individuals know that Steve has access to that resource.
Interesting dynamic there. The different nuance as you're looking at this multi-factor environment. Colonel Clancy, how about lessons learned at the DoD as you're implementing and embarking on this? I'm calling it PIV Card 2.0, or we'll call it CAT Card 2.0 in your case.
Well, I think, Luke, that's a great part of the lessons learned, is that because we have this ecosystem of credentials we're trying to foster that preserve that assurance level. We also have different environments like the cloud, where we're trying to provide a more consistent authentication and authorization assurance environment. We're finding that there's kind of two places where we need to make sure that we're providing an adequately formed set of capabilities in the architecture. The first is as an identity provider. Where we understand what are all the authenticators in the space, how do they correspond to people and non-people. You talked about IoT and some of these robotic process automation and AI. All of those things, we don't want to place the burden for configuration management and planning at every resource that's in the environment. We want to use the architecture in these services to sort of provide a consistent, adequate presentation of the trust and the assurance to a specific relying party. The other one is on the authorization side. Just like we were talking about in terms of lifecycle management, we've got people coming, we've got people going. We don't need to create a mechanism where we connect every one of those relying parties back to the authoritative identity attributes for people and things. We have to find a way to consolidate that and also present to the auditors, whether they're cybersecurity, insider threat, or even the financial management services folks, they have to be able to see across a broad set of relying parties who has access to what, and is that correct based on a fairly complex and increasingly complex set of rules. So from a Department of Defense perspective, this identity provider, that authentication federation, as well as this provisioning and authorization lifecycle management are really the cornerstones of let's set something as a fundamental that we can continue to evolve over time as we understand better what's happening in the
Yeah, I
space.
think about things like also, what comes up a lot now is this continuous authorization issue that, I'm sure you guys will touch on, or this is the whole dormant account thing just scares the heck out of me. Shane, how about at KPMG? You see a lot of different things out there. What do you see as far as the lessons learned that maybe several of your clients, continue to sort of, stumble into?
Yeah, I think that those are some good answers that I think we just heard, right? So, I mean, the lesson that I've learned over my time in IAM is that simply IAM is really hard. I mean, it's a difficult program to implement. The tools are different. The ideas are complex.
Well, you're touching everything.
You're touching
right?
everything, and so I mean, the lesson that I've always learned is that you have to come at it from the right angle, right? You need to start with top level kind of management buy-in, organizational level support, and they need to understand how IAM ties into the mission of the agency, right? So if that tie-in isn't there, you're going to lose support either right then or eventually when things get bogged down. And it will get bogged down because, like I said, IAM is difficult. Like all the new technologies that we're seeing, those aren't going to stop, right? So right now we're doing things like moving to the cloud, and we're starting to talk about intelligent automation and bots on the network and those things. And those are new challenges that we kind of have to continually face. And you have to start with that organizational level buy-in and having everyone there as much as possible understand how IAM fits and supports that mission, not hinders it, to be able to be successful in any kind of implementation.
And look, bots are real. I mean, if you look at the whole RPA, evolution, I mean, it's exploding out there, and I think certainly in the federal government you're going to see a lot more of that. Amir, you guys have been blazing the trail over there in a variety of ways. Can you share some lessons learned that as the other agencies that are in the process of some of the stuff you've blazed through that you could share with them, giving them a heads up of things to be thinking about?
Sure, absolutely. I'll name a couple. The first one that comes to mind is really executive buy-in. You heard Jay talk about this in his Identity Access Management Council, talked about Colonel Clancy with the CIO strategy from Department of Defense. Similarly, at Homeland Security, we have a governance council for ICAM as a whole with our CIO and CSO chairing it for the department. But specifically for our lifecycle management or identity governance, we have all of the CXOs for the management directorate chairing a body for this. We take them all of our priorities, we take them the decisions, we take them the blockers, and they really are able to pave the path for us and knock down our hurdles. This is really what's caused us to be able to collaborate across offices, join data across our offices, get that cleaned up, and really change business processes to make these programs successful. So that's number one big ticket item. Get the executive buy-in, because every time you have a challenge, they'll help you knock it down.
Yeah.
The second item, you heard Shane talk about this in terms of customer-driven. We have the same mentality in terms of really listen and hear the voice of your customer. While it's great, and I completely agree with compliance and making sure that we're in line with policy.
The wooden mallet.
Right, but ultimately you need to be able to provide your customers what they're looking for. So
Sure.
we have an agenda, we have a backlog of things that we need to get done. We prioritize them. But to be honest with you, we move in an agile fashion, and every time I hear a customer of mine, whether it's a component, a financial system facing an audit finding, one of the CXOs of our council that says they have a specific challenge that we can solve, I prioritize those higher. And as I'm able to meet these customer-driven challenges, I gain more and more support through the organization, and they back our services more, allowing them to expand. And when we get to those hard decisions, we've built that customer buy-in, we've built that executive buy-in, and we're able to achieve more collectively.
I think it's great. You know, I joke tongue-in-cheek about the wooden mallet, but I mean, we kind of did go through that, right? It was sort of one size, and that was it. And you know, you're going to eat your piece whether you like it or not. And it somewhat worked, but you know, with the evolution of the new technology that's available, and OMB's willingness to meet the spirit and intent, I think those two things have allowed you to be more flexible, more customer focused. And I hear governance a lot, which is interesting that you typically didn't hear in this type of a forum. Well, I'm going to move over to challenges, and this is always an area that we love to once again highlight so that people can think about that and look at ways that you've overcome those. Perhaps let's start with you, Jay, at the FBI. You know, what is a sort of the one or two challenges, hurdles that you're trying to work through, or perhaps have worked through, in regards to implementing this capability?
So, I mean, there's three broad challenges: complexity, diversity, and controlling cost. You know, as new IAM technologies become available, we don't seem to be reducing the complexity of the environment or the diversity of the environment. It's ever increasing. The FBI runs 3 different security enclaves. We have 3 different credentialing solutions that have to be managed and maintained. So again, the costs that are driven from that are enormous in some cases, and there's this tendency to believe that it's just a card. It doesn't cost that much, but these cards are quite expensive. Right. And
when you multiply them by tens of thousands.
Exactly.
Sure.
And then the underlying technologies, because sometimes the card changes, then the devices that read the cards need to change, and that is millions of dollars as well. So again, those kinds of challenges need to be thought ahead of time as you start to explore these types of technologies. You've got to, again, take into consideration what those future year costs will be in making sure that you're upgrading. Additionally, we're now toting around more and more devices, whether it's cards or tokens. We have people that have 3 or 4 or more cards dangling from their neck, whether it's the newer technologies or the more traditional technologies. Cards that separately get you into an FBI building but don't get you into any other building, or cards that get you access to a system on the enclave side won't get you into a system on some other enclave. Sure. So I mean, again, I think a lot of our challenges got to be, how do we come up with a technology solution that we can collapse some of these IAM devices and control our costs? Because again, I'm going to stress the fact that for every device that you produce, that you basically deploy, you have to have a staff that maintains it, and those costs become incredible over time.
Sure, sure. Well, we're talking about challenges, and we're going to take a short break, and we'll come back and talk some more about those. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. With me on today's show are Amir Dastouri, Department of Homeland Security, Jay Brooks with the FBI, Colonel Clancy, Department of Defense, Shane Cashdollar, KPMG, and Steve Schmalz with Public Sector RSA. We were talking about challenges, and we're going to throw it over to you, Shane, and give us some examples of the challenges that you're seeing out there as your clients are trying to implement this capability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we, it's come up again through this kind of conversation, is how important that organizational top-level management buy-in is, right? And you heard Amir talk about
that a lot today.
Yeah, you heard Amir talk about the level of support that they have at DHS, and look how successful they've been when they have that support. So I think that that's the main challenge. So to talk about how you achieve it, right? It's one thing to say, like, we need it, but how do we get it? We always encourage our clients to to have goals, right? You got to make sure you have them first, because let's level set. Where are we trying to go with this program? And then it's around kind of performance metrics, identifying them, tracking them, transparency into your program, and then accountability for your program, right? So don't make that senior leadership guess how your program is going. Have a really clearly defined set of kind of key performance indicators, track them, put it up to them. If you have those, you can actually determine ROI, right? I think ROI has been talked about in IAM for a long time as something that should be there. Maybe sometimes it is, maybe sometimes it isn't. But if you really get into those kind of KPIs, track it, have the transparency in your program, you can really demonstrate ROI, which does exist for these programs. And if you want buy-in, show them some ROI, and you'll get it.
Blocking and tackling on program management. Amir, how about at DHS? What about the challenges as you guys blaze the trail on this journey?
Sure. So some of the specific challenges, I'll start with data. As I mentioned, what we've done is really put a lot of our systems together. We've correlated, combined all these systems that used to be separate. As we join them together and make decisions based on identity and decisions based on access, you quickly learn that the data is really not up to par. Not necessarily sanitized, not necessarily normalized, and you have to spend a lot of time making sure that people are managing data, because we're starting to make decisions off of it. We're moving towards entitlements and attributes and policies, and if you don't have the right data in your systems to make those decisions, it makes that hard. So we spend a good considerable amount of time on each of our rollouts or each of our phases of our projects, making sure whatever data we're using gets sanitized. Other than that, a couple others, business process changes, manual processes. Again, as we strive more towards automation, it causes change. So change management and communications are huge challenges. So those are really the solutions to the problem. But as we roll out to the organizations, convincing people to do things a little bit differently, convincing manual processes to be automated, forms to be made more electronic. Those all come with challenges that are overcome by a good communications program, a good change management program, and good awareness. And finally, again, as we strive towards enterprise services and consolidation, we always try to keep in mind what is good for enterprise versus component, because obviously we don't want to impact mission, and we don't want to negatively disrupt operations, but we want to try to centralize where we can, so that trade-off of what makes sense as enterprise and what should stay local for local authorization and local decisions from an identity perspective is another challenge that we continuously try to overcome.
Delicate balance there, right, all the time in regards to laying out your enterprise but allowing you to execute as a component, driving those missions. Colonel, how about at DoD? What about the challenges there that you're recognizing?
Well, I think Amir just laid out a great synopsis of the dynamics in a large organization, all of this. That was great. I think, you know, you kind of said this before. I mean, identity is really a team sport. And getting all those players on the same page to make these moves and move the change is really hard, because you know, when you talk about what is identity, you're talking about how do you bring all of your people, all of their authorities and missions, and make that something that is workable and as a group and interoperable in the networks. I mean, that's basically every facet of an organization. Every authority, whether it's personnel security, human resources, you've got financial authorities in the space, everything that has to do with your mission, you're trying to carry across as a part of that person's digital identity and make it available to the applications. That's a lot of stuff. So you've got to make sure that you have a broad team at the table and understand what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve. And that gets back to governance. If you look at identity through any specific narrow focus, you're not going to see the actual problem that your organization is trying to solve. Sure. It touches your performance as an organization and your mission. It gets to how you can perform at the lowest cost while being effective, and also all the cybersecurity and mission. Identity is all of those things. So bringing the right people to the table and making sure you're solving an adequately framed problem is always a challenge.
Yeah, sort of this holistic view of identity. Steve, how about at RSA? What are the challenges that you're seeing out there that, you know, perhaps these various clients are encountering that most notably RSA is probably solving?
Well, one of the big challenges is using your understanding of the various individuals in the organization, their behavior when it comes to looking for threats. So almost every one of these all these major organizations have security operations centers whose job it is to monitor network traffic, endpoint, aggregate logs. Bringing information about individuals and individuals' behavior into that equation makes things a lot easier. Not only helps you determine the insider threat, but it helps you cut down on the number of things you need to look at. If you know the behavior of individuals as they log on a network, and if you can bring all the information that you've gathered from your identity assurance framework into that security operations center and effectively use that, then you can make it a lot more likely that you'll identify threats as they start appearing within your organization.
Sure.
So to me, I think that's one of the bigger challenges. How to take all the identity assurance mechanisms, framework, knowledge, and bring it into that front line, the Security Operations Center, looking for that next advanced persistent threat.
Right. And as these bad actors get more sophisticated, it's almost like an arms race, if you will, there. Well, we're gonna start with some wrap-up questions. We got a little over 10 minutes left, and I always like to look at the future, sort of paint a picture out there, and look over the horizon a little bit. We're going to start with you, Steve, at the end of the table and walk our way back. We might have a little turbo round at the end if we've got a couple of minutes, but tell us about the future. What does it look like out there? I'm not talking 10 years out there. I'm talking, 2 and 3 years out there. This technology is moving at a tectonic shift. The environment's moving at a tectonic shift. What's it look like out there?
So to us, the future looks like a future focused on identity assurance, bringing in all of the factors that you need to authenticate someone, then making sure that the right governance infrastructure is in place, to make sure that they're looking at resources they're supposed to be looking at, and that everybody has been involved in making those decisions, and that information, as I just mentioned previously, is integrated into your threat detection mechanisms in the organization so that you can help recognize threats as they evolve. In other words, what we see is sort of the aggregation of all of the existing technologies, all of which work in isolation very well, but bringing them holistically together to provide that extra factor of security that organizations are looking for.
I think there's a lot of technologists, and probably more importantly, a lot of managers who manage those technologists that would love to see some of this stuff get homogenized and rolled up, and so that they're not dealing with this digital soup, if you will, and trying to manage this stuff. All right, Jay, what's the future look like? Are we ever going to get to the point where a special agent's only going to have one card on them and not 3 or 4? When I was at DOJ, I think I had 6.
You're in top form then. I mean, there are contests actually as to who has the most cards. 2 to 3 years out, so not an awful long time to look ahead in, but 2 words: consolidation and elimination. So looking at technologies like PIV cards, how do we use that to eliminate some token-based solutions as well as some of the physical security solutions that we have? These could be extremely cost savings for the FBI, and we do have plans being drawn up as far as doing some piloting in these areas about how do we consolidate some of these technologies and eliminate some of these multi-factor solutions. And then how do we look at deploying some identity provisioning types of technologies that can eliminate passwords. That's another challenge that we have, and that is the continuing use of sign-on and passwords and the maintenance of those types of attributes for people. By using
passwords were dead.
Yeah, you would think so, but they're not. and again, it is just more of a cost and more of an inefficiency within an organization to do that. I mean, you're challenged all the time. If we have cards and we have tokens, why do we still need passwords? But yet you do. And there are technologies that can help you get to that single sign-on, nirvana that people are constantly pursuing. How do we eliminate that? And it's by looking at some of these more exotic technologies to make it happen.
Sure. Shane, how about at KPMG? What does the future look like when you guys look over the horizon, if you will?
I think the future of IAM is exciting, and I'm excited to see where it goes, to see where it's come from in the past few years, and I think the kind of recurring theme is the consolidation, right? Being able to leverage stuff that other agencies have done, so you don't have to redo it, you don't have to rebuild it. And I think Amir touched on it earlier. That kind of data normalization is such an important component of that, to be able to enable that to work, and we're seeing real progress in that. So I think that's something that we're going to get to in the next couple of years, where I don't have to go build a new access management system. I don't have to re-engineer my identity proofing process, which I think we're going to see a lot of neat advancements in the next couple of years for remote identity proofing, smartphone facial recognition, biometric capture, that way where you can really increase the assurance level of the authentication and identity proofing events without making it much more intrusive on the end user, right? So that's great for everyone. Then you combine that to the authentication token, and then use it across agencies, right? Once that kind of integration is done, and that's going to lead to a lot more happy end users and a lot more cost savings for agencies, and I think it's going to be interesting to see it work.
Proofing has really matured over the last couple of years, and I think with the onset of sort of using AI and really running algorithms against all that capability, that digital dust, if you will, along with these other attributes, it appears that the rate, the accuracy rate on that is phenomenal, right? And it's only going to get better, particularly as the AI gets better and we learn more and the machines get taught more, but also just because of there's going to be more digital dust out there, if you will, good or bad. Colonel Clancy, how about at DoD? What does a future look like? Will there ever be a PIV card that's a CAT card and it all becomes one? And
I think one of the things I would describe it, this multi-fabric environment is one of the things that I think the data folks, when we really understand as an organization what data can bring to the table, and we start re-engineering the network around that, we're going to see a bunch of things fundamentally change, and identity has to be a part of that network refactoring. Right now, we're really kind of prisoners of the user session, right?
Sure.
People build applications and services so that people can interact with them. When that's no longer enough, and we need IoT devices or robotic process automation type things, or advanced AI software, when we need them to be as dynamic and as empowered in the network, operating with larger sums of data, we're going to have to figure out how to bring them on. How do we proof? How do we maintain or assert suitability and fitness and maintain that for those types of devices? I think we're gonna have to pace ourselves. What I'm concerned about is we get to where we really understand what data can do for us, and then we have to wait to build in the fundamental identity part for all those new devices.
Yeah, you can't outstrip the supply line, right? I mean, it's very important to have a good balance there as far as the ability to implement this stuff and the ability to absorb it. And I know that somebody talked about these legacy environments, right? Just trying to identity proof the sort of the edge, but having to deal with some of these back end systems that can't accept some of this technology in a way that the two just don't work very well together.
And I think
All the more reason why we need to modernize our entire environments, right?
I think that's absolutely right, and we have to take a data-centric approach to identity as a part of the larger network and cybersecurity systems. What we were talking about before in terms of active identity and trying to bring more environmental factors to the network, you might look at it in terms of retrospective versus inline. Right now, we have a lot of advanced analytic capabilities that can ingest all these sources from our cybersecurity defense in depth devices and systems, and retrospectively figure out that there's bad things happening in the network, and we get that attribution. What I think we need to do is, as we identify what those really useful conclusions are, we have to figure out how do we bring that into the user session so the relying party can be a part of making a determination using all this rich identity information. Make that available to the relying party so they can make better policy decisions.
Sure, and I think this is where this continued authorization is really important too, as they sort of bring that into that sort of log-on environment, if you will. Amir, Tell us about the future, right? Well, what's cooking over there at DHS in regards to, painting a picture on how we're going to be looking at identity into the future?
Sure. So I'll touch on three different topics for the future. The first one's really a combination of what everyone's been talking about and kind of the buzzword for zero trust networks. So we've talked about on-prem, we've talked about cloud. Steve mentioned that you have your user on your desktop, but also a mobile device at a Starbucks. So we don't know where the people are coming from, and our environment's more distributed. So kind of the whole framework of assume that the threat is already inside. With that, we already have a good grasp of identity. We know who our peoples are. I mentioned through the data cleanup and other things we're doing, we have a good grasp of the attributes we have. But Luke, to your point about kind of these bots and Internet of Things, but it's also about the devices that people use to authenticate. So it's really being able to identify the person, what device they came on, and making more fine-grained access control decisions based on the combination of those environments to all of our systems and data. So that whole zero threat concept. The second one that was also touched upon, which I strongly also believe with Colonel Clancy and Steve also, is the behavior analytics. Really understanding what our users are doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it, and the automation and machine learning that you mentioned, you're able to paint a better picture of, even though this is a credentialed guy that I've seen before, well, he's not really acting like himself today. Is it really him? Is he up to no good? Did someone compromise him? And through that learning and analytics and combination of security and identity, you can really paint that picture of, is this the right actor and are they doing the right thing? Finally, this isn't really blazing in the future. It's kind of a continuation, but I believe standards will continue to evolve. I still think that integration is the hardest part. We build these identity services, but as we bring our applications and systems and consumers on, we're still spending way too much development and engineering resources integrating our applications with these services. So things like standards for provisioning like SCIM, continued authentication, where we see SAML still prevalent, OpenID, FIDO. So as these standards kind of continue, I'm hoping that the applications work. And kind of on the password issue, I think we killed password at the layer. I think we're good at the network, we're good at the mission essential, but I also think that we push passwords in the closet because there's still a lot of legacy out there that really needs to evolve, and we can really kill password for good.
Someday we will, but until then, we want to thank the folks here. I want to thank the guests for taking the time on your busy schedules to join us for this program. I'd like to thank the sponsors for without we don't have a show. I'd like to thank the good people here at Federal News Radio that make our program so successful and enjoyable. And most of all, I'd like to thank the listening audience out there who tune in every month. You've been listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.